Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Arkansas Hills history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. The Arkansas Hills Colony was never intended to be remembered. It was incorporated into the enlarging county limits of what would eventually become Benton County after making a fleeting appearance on maps between 1868 and 1874, nestled in the forested valleys of northwest Arkansas. Today, all that is left of this village is a collection of stone foundations that are hardly discernible due to decades of forest growth along the White River's eastern bank. Some stories, even when purposefully deleted, will not be silenced. The history of such locations are frequently lost to time, their narrative disappearing with the last witnesses. Historian Dr. Margaret Holloway discovered a number of irregularities in the church records in northwest Arkansas in the fall of 1962, while she was gathering information for a thorough investigation of frontier religious institutions. Recurrent references to an incident at Lawson Chapel in letters between local Baptist authorities between 1872 and 1874 caught her interest. She was unable to locate an official record of any such establishment in the ecclesiastical registry, however. In spite of these references, the chapel itself appeared to have been deliberately erased from history. Dr. Holloway's increasing interest in this historical gap is documented in her research notes, which are kept in the archives of the University of Arkansas. Her words, "The absence itself speaks volumes." Her investigation led her to a small county museum in Rogers, where she found an incomplete 1870 map that identified a Lawson meeting house along what was then known as Timber Creek Road, about 7 miles northeast of Bentonville. Such deliberate omission suggests not negligence, but purpose. A 6-month investigation ensued, which would take up Dr. Holloway's professional time until her sudden resignation in 1963 due to personal health issues. Before being cataloged as part of a larger historical study in 1968, the documents she gathered partial church ledgers, private correspondence, newspaper clippings, and local testimonies remained locked in university archives. The originals were apparently destroyed in 1969 during a campus construction, and the records were later microfilmed. What is left is a disjointed but unsettling picture of what happened over a century prior to Dr. Holloway's inquiry, events that several parties had worked hard to conceal. The narrative starts with Reverend Thomas Lawson, who came to Arkansas Hills at the beginning of 1871. Land records show that on March 17th of that year, Lawson bought 5 acres of land from a man named Joseph Hardin. Lawson had come from Tennessee with references from established Baptist congregations, but oddly, attempts to confirm these references decades later turned up no documentation of his prior pastoral work. The deed describes the property as wooded land with natural spring suitable for community worship. In April 1871, the chapel's construction got underway. According to local press stories, the community is working together to create a lovely timber structure. The chapel was finished by September, with a dedication service attended by almost 40 local families. On June 10, 1871, the short-lived local newspaper, the Arkansas Hills Gazette, reported, "The new house of worship nears completion under Reverend Lawson's careful direction. The Reverend, a bachelor of scholarly disposition, has shown remarkable skill in both carpentry and spiritual guidance." Even in its first shape, the structure was unique. The chapel, which was constructed mostly of local oak and pine, had an unusually high ceiling, with exposed beams arranged in what Lawson called acoustically optimized patterns. The windows were higher than most frontier churches, and the colored glass panes were imported from St. Louis at a significant cost. The pulpit, which was built in the middle of the assembly rather than at the front as was typical, was the most prominent feature. Pews were arranged in a semicircular design around the pulpit. This design would allow the word to resonate equally among all gathered, Lawson told interested parishioners. The site itself appeared to have been picked specifically for its remoteness. The chapel was located where Timber Creek poured out of a limestone ledge, over a mile from the closest neighbor, even though it was officially inside the borders of the Arkansas Hill community. Since the area's initial development, local settlers had been aware of this natural spring, which was renowned for its exceptional clarity and year-round temperature. This story, which is woven together from disparate pieces, hesitant testimonials, and the glaring silences that frequently scream louder than words, centers on what transpired during the 15 months between the chapel's opening and eventual abandonment. Perhaps the last living individual with direct knowledge of the events was Sarah Millbrook, who was interviewed by Dr. Holloway in 1962 at the age of 96. She had been going to the chapel with her parents for around 10 months when she was 8 years old. Even though time had blurred her memory, there were features in it that aligned with other evidence that was found. The Reverend was a tall man, she remembered. Millbrook recounted the gradual changes in the chapel and its congregation, saying, "Always dressed properly, with hands that seemed too large for his body. He spoke in a way that made you listen, even when you didn't understand the words. The chapel smelled of pine sap and beeswax. There was a cellar beneath where the Reverend said the baptismal waters were blessed. At first it was like any meeting house. Folks would gather, sing the old hymns, listen to scripture. But the Reverend, he began changing things, slowly at first, a new song here, a different prayer there. By Christmas of '71, the services had become strange. He'd have us repeat phrases over and over, standing in patterns on the floor he'd marked with chalk. Some nights when the moon was right, you could hear music coming from the chapel, though no regular service was scheduled. My father forbade us from attending after February, when Mrs. Langley collapsed during service, shaking and speaking words none could understand. The Reverend called it the First Awakening and seemed pleased rather than concerned. Reverend Lawson became a major player in the tiny community very fast. In addition to Sunday services, he planned monthly community suppers, a ladies' aid club, and Wednesday prayer sessions. In correspondence, he was described as learned, devoted, and possessing natural authority. Despite these commonplace niceties, Dr. Holloway sensed a faint undertone of uneasiness that infused even the most glowing portrayals. The Reverend's sermons, which deviated from the conventional Baptist doctrine of the time, were the main source of this uneasiness. Brother Lawson's theology contains elements I find difficult to place within our tradition. His frequent references to vessels of divine purpose and the flesh as sacred instrument seem drawn from sources beyond the accepted canon. When questioned, he speaks of private revelation and ancient wisdom recovered. Campbell's letter, written in November 1871, was addressed to his superior in Little Rock. Campbell's letter goes on to describe Lawson's unusual personal effects. His private study contains texts in languages I cannot identify, certainly neither Greek nor Hebrew, which one might expect in a scholarly minister's collection. When I inquired about them, he spoke of older tongues that shaped the waters of creation and suggested that the conventional Bible translations capture merely the surface ripples of deeper currents. Most concerning was a peculiar instrument in his quarters, something like an organ but modified with tubes leading to vessels of water. When I expressed curiosity, he merely smiled and said, "It was for calling those who dwell in deeper harmonies." According to architectural notes discovered in Reverend Lawson's personal notebook, which were partially retrieved from a trunk in the abandoned parsonage, the chapel itself had unique features. The journal entry from May 14, 1871 states, "The proportions must be maintained precisely, 33 feet in length, 21 inches width, with ceiling height of 12 feet at center. The alignment with the spring is essential. The waters must flow beneath the altar space, where the resonance is strongest." Another entry from July 3, 1871, during construction, demonstrates Lawson's concentrated attention to the subterranean features. The building was built with specific dimensions that he claimed were divinely ordained. The workers questioned the necessity of the extensive stonework around the spring basin, believing a simple wooden structure would suffice. They cannot understand that the mineral composition affects the acoustic properties. I have dismissed their concerns by suggesting it prevents contamination of the baptismal waters. In truth, the limestone amplifies the subtle vibrations that common ears cannot detect. When the proper frequencies are achieved, the boundaries between water and flesh become permeable. The church was the hub of Arkansas Hills community activity by January 1872. According to records, the congregation regularly consists of about 70 members, which represents a sizable section of the community. Additionally, Reverend Lawson had started to draw interest from distant regions, with people coming from great distances to hear his increasingly unique sermons. One such sermon provides insight into the Reverend's changing message. It is largely documented in a personal diary kept by Elizabeth Hardin, the wife of the man who sold Lawson the land. The Reverend spoke today of the voice in the waters. He said that our bodies are like the chapel itself, vessels built to specific proportions designed to resonate with divine harmonies. He spoke of the sacred geography of flesh and how some are chosen as perfect instruments. Mrs. Tunney whispered that she found it all strange talk for a Baptist service, but Jacob Mercer and his wife seemed deeply moved, as did the Whitfield family. Elizabeth's diary entry from January 18, 1872, details the widening rifts among the group. There seems to be a separation occurring among the congregation, those who embrace the Reverend's new teachings and those who quietly maintain reservation. The former group stays after regular services for what Lawson calls deeper communion. They emerge hours later looking strangely affected, eyes dilated, movements languid. Speaking in hushed tones about the singing beneath, Joseph says we should distance ourselves. But curiosity pulls at me. What transforms them so profoundly? The Reverend watches me during services now, as if measuring my potential for something I cannot name. The earliest known worries date back to February 1872, when local doctor Dr. James Whitfield, who was also a chapel member, wrote to a Fayetteville medical colleague, "I am perplexed by symptoms presenting in several patients from the congregation at Lawson Chapel. They report identical disturbances, persistent ringing in the ears, especially at night, accompanied by vivid dreams they are reluctant to describe. Physical examination reveals no obvious cause. More troubling is their shared conviction that these experiences are not afflictions to be treated, but rather awakenings to be embraced." Reverend Lawson has apparently interpreted these symptoms as signs of spiritual elevation. The letter goes on to make further observations. The Mercer family, Jacob, Rebecca, and their adult son Thomas, NDM, now spend nearly all their waking hours at the chapel. When I visited their farm on the pretext of checking a minor ailment, I observed concerning changes in their appearance. All three have lost significant weight, their skin has acquired an unusual pallor, and they move with an unnatural fluidity, as if their joints have been somehow altered. Most disturbing was their synchronized speech. They often complete one another's sentences or speak in unison without apparent coordination. When I mentioned this, they smiled in identical fashion and said only that the waters have aligned us. I fear some form of mass delusion has taken hold, possibly exacerbated by contamination of the spring water they consume during chapel rituals. These awakenings had reached over 1/3 of the church by March. According to community statistics, the chapel has seen an increase in activity, with some members participating in daily prayer sessions that occasionally lasted far into the night. What Reverend Lawson called deeper communion, or private services for people going through the awakening, took place in the chapel's cellar, which was first used for storage and baptism preparation. One of the few official records that survive the subsequent purge is a partial church ledger that lists 27 people under the heading Vessels Prepared, with dates ranging from March to July 1872. The terms waters received and resonance achieved, albeit not defined, are mentioned in adjacent entries. More illuminating is a private notebook that Dr. Holloway found among Joseph Hardin's belongings, which he had maintained following the chapel's destruction, and which appears to have belonged to Lawson himself. On one page, a cross-section of a human head, with the auditory canals highlighted and altered, is accompanied by the following note: "After sufficient exposure to the frequencies, the physical restructuring begins naturally. The waters reshape their vessels from within, opening channels between worlds that mundane flesh normally blocks. The notebook includes intricate anatomical drawings of the human ear and throat, annotated with cryptic references to primary resonance chambers and secondary amplification structures. The first disappearance took place in April 1872. 42-year-old Jackson Mercer, a farmer and loyal chapel member, did not come home after a Wednesday night service. He had been having the awakenings for weeks, according to his wife, and had received an invitation to participate in a special midnight service in the chapel crypt. In response to an inquiry, Reverend Lawson clarified that Mercer had left possessions behind as a sign of trust after receiving a calling to take the ministry to another community. Since such abrupt missionary initiatives were not unusual in frontier religious communities, this interpretation was initially accepted. Rebecca Mercer did, however, voice lingering reservations in a later letter dated the 29th of April, 1872, to her sister in Missouri. The Reverend delivered a letter supposedly from Jackson yesterday, speaking of his work in a new community near the territorial line. The hand did not look like his, nor did the words sound as he speaks. When I mentioned this, the Reverend smiled in that way he has, as if listening to something beyond my hearing, and said that the waters change how a man forms his thoughts. I do not know what to make of this, but I find myself unable to sleep without hearing what sounds like Jackson's voice calling from somewhere beneath the floorboards of our home. The letter continues with observations that indicate that Rebecca's own change has started. I've started to hear the singing the whole others described, not with my ears exactly, but somewhere deeper. The Reverend says this is normal, that the waters call to those ready to hear. Thomas, their son, hears it too, more clearly than I do. He sits for hours by the creek that flows from the chapel spring, listening with his fingers trailing in the current. His skin has developed a strange translucence, particularly between his fingers, where I can almost see the bones beneath. The Reverend says this is a sign of his readiness. We are scheduled for immersion next week, after which the Reverend says we will better understand Jackson's journey. The chapel saw a surge in activity over the next 2 months, with services now taking place nearly every day. Reverend Lawson started talking more freely about a theory he dubbed the communion of waters and flesh, which he said stood for the actual hidden significance of baptism. He claimed that the spring beneath the chapel had unique qualities that, when prepared, could awaken the body's dormant harmony, according to testimonies from people who eventually left the church. The spring had been directed into a stone basin in the chapel cellar, where a number of ceremonies were performed as part of this preparation. After 3 days of fasting, participants would attend nightly rituals that included chanting and what was called the Reverend's special music, which was reportedly played on a modified reed organ with pipes that extended into the water basin. The chosen ones would then be submerged in the spring water as Lawson carried out what he called the laying on of hands upon the sacred points of resonance. An excerpt from Lawson's journal from the 12th of May, 1872, provides unsettling context for these behaviors. The Whitfield woman progresses rapidly. After only 3 immersions, the transformation has begun along her neck and hands. The membranes are forming cleanly, without the unfortunate calcification that occurred with Subject 4, presumably Jackson Mercer. The integration of the resonance chambers with her existing auditory structures proceeds as theorized. She can now perceive the full spectrum of the deeper harmonies, not merely the surface vibrations that the untransformed mistake for ordinary sound. Her husband grows suspicious despite his own partial awakening. His scientific mind resists full surrender to the waters. He must either advance to complete immersion soon or be removed from the congregation. His position in the community makes him either a valuable vessel or a dangerous impediment. Following these unique rituals, 3 further members of the congregation, Mary Sutton, Thomas Garner, and Eliza Whitfield, the doctor's wife, had vanished by June 1872. Although Reverend Lawson supplied letters in each instance stating that they had been called to missionary work, Dr. Holloway's thorough study of local church records almost a century later revealed no evidence of their arrival at any other settlement. Now that his own wife had vanished, Dr. Whitfield started to voice personal worries. In an entry dated June 24, 1872, he wrote, "I can no longer silence my professional judgment. What I initially attributed to religious fervor in my patients now presents as symptoms consistent with prolonged exposure to an unknown toxin. The persistent oral disturbances, pupillary dilation, elevated pulse, and eventual personality transformation suggest a physiological rather than spiritual cause. I have taken samples from the chapel spring for analysis, though I must do so discreetly. Lawson watches me with increasing suspicion, claiming my scientific inquiry represents a failure of faith. Perhaps it does, for I cannot reconcile his teachings with the evidence before me. Last night I dreamed of Eliza, not as departed on mission, but as somehow still present beneath the chapel floor, her voice distorted as if speaking through water." A later entry from July 2nd shows how his inquiry was going. The water analysis shows unusual mineral content, high concentrations of compounds I cannot identify with my limited equipment. More concerning is the presence of organic material suspended in the water, microscopic structures that bear no resemblance to any known algae or bacteria. Under magnification, these structures appear almost architectural in nature, as if constructed rather than grown. They respond to sound vibrations in the testing dish, reorganizing themselves when exposed to certain frequencies. I have also managed to examine Thomas Garner's abandoned home. Hidden beneath floorboards in his bedroom, I discovered a journal documenting his transformation. The early entries describe experiences similar to other affected congregation members: auditory phenomena, vivid dreams, altered perception. Later entries become increasingly incoherent, but contain disturbing details about physical changes. The spaces between my fingers fill with translucent tissue. My throat expands to accommodate new structures. I can feel the vibrations reorganizing my inner ear. The final entry, dated just before his disappearance, reads only, "The water no longer feels wet to me. It feels like home. I must bring these findings to the county authorities, though I fear they will think me mad." As the summer wore on, the discomfort in the neighborhood increased. Regular Sunday service attendance started to fall, and the inner circle of awakened members grew more and more cut off from the outside world. According to reports from other towns, residents of the Arkansas Hills were changed and talking in circles about waters and vessels. During this time, a number of families moved in secret, although they were still unwilling to publicly discuss their reasons for doing so. The situation became more heated in July 1872 after Harold, Martha, and their teenage son William, the Tunney family, vanished. In contrast to earlier instances, no letters of explanation were generated. Reverend Lawson reportedly responded to questions from the community, which were becoming more and more concerned, by saying that the family had achieved perfect resonance and would speak through the waters when the time was proper. However, this evasive response was not enough to allay rising anxieties. The original land seller, Joseph Hardin, and 7 other well-known community members drafted a petition asking local Baptist officials to step in. Dr. Holloway found the petition in denominational archives, which raised issues with alterations to the chapel structure inconsistent with its approved design, inexplicable absences, and unconventional behaviors. Through Dr. Whitfield's ongoing research, it became more apparent what these changes meant. When Reverend Lawson was summoned away to a nearby hamlet in late July, the doctor, who had kept up a charade of allegiance to avoid suspicion, was able to enter the chapel. His hurried notes, which were later discovered in his personal belongings, detail unsettling changes made to the chapel and the crypt below. The pews have been arranged in concentric circles around a central point where the pulpit once stood. This point now contains a circular opening approximately 3 feet in diameter, covered with a wooden lid when not in use. The opening leads directly to the cellar below. The walls have been carved with repeating patterns that appear to be stylized human forms intertwined with wave-like designs. The cellar itself has been extensively modified. The natural spring has been channeled into a circular basin approximately 12 feet in diameter, an unknown depth. The surface reflects no light cast upon it, despite apparent clarity. Around this basin, The floor has been cut with channels leading to 7 alcoves carved into the earth walls. These alcoves contain what appear to be sleeping pallets, though the stains and odors suggest purposes beyond rest. The modified organ now extends from the chapel above, with pipes descending directly into the water. Most disturbing are the specimens preserved in glass jars arranged on shelves along the eastern wall. Biological materials. I hesitate to identify with certainty, though they appear to be human tissue samples systematically labeled with names corresponding to missing congregation members. Adjacent to these, Lawson has assembled an extensive collection of anatomical texts, many in languages I cannot identify, with pages marked concerning the human auditory system and neural structures. I have taken water samples and 1 specimen jar for analysis. I fear I have remained silent too long, allowing professional courtesy and natural skepticism to override what I now recognize as clear evidence of profound wrongdoing. Whitfield may have discovered something considerably more unsettling, according to a hastily scrawled update to these notes. Found hidden chamber beyond northern alcove. Access concealed behind shelving unit. Space contains what can only be described as cultivation tanks, glass containers large enough to hold adult human bodies, filled with spring water, and connected to a complex tubing system. 3 tanks are occupied. The submerged forms are recognizable as human in basic structure, but significantly altered. Elongated limbs, enhanced webbing between fingers and toes, translucent skin revealing modified internal structures. One subject opened its eyes as I approached. I recognized Eliza's features, though distorted by the transformation. Her eyes tracked my movement, and she pressed a hand against the glass, the fingers now joined by translucent membranes extending to the second knuckle. I could discern no breathing apparatus, suggesting the subjects now extract oxygen directly from the water. Before I could document further details, I heard movement in the cellar above. I replaced the shelving and departed immediately. Will contact County Sheriff tomorrow with complete evidence. Dr. Whitfield was never given the chance to share his research. His house office caught fire on the 2nd of August 1872. The doctor and the majority of his records were destroyed in the fire. Citing evidence of an overturned lamp, the local policeman declared the incident to be an accident. No documentation or specimens found at the spot were mentioned. According to Elizabeth Hardin's August 3rd diary post, the fire might not have been an accident. Dr. Whitfield's death has cast a pall over the community. Joseph suspects involvement from the chapel devotees, noting that Thomas Garner's brother was seen near the Whitfield home shortly before the fire was reported. The constable dismisses such talk, but then he has been attending Lawson's private services since May. Joseph spoke with Reverend Morrison from the Regional Association today, expressing our growing fears. The Reverend promised to visit next month to investigate matters personally. I pray he arrives before others disappear. The creek that runs from the chapel spring now carries a strange odor, and fish are found dead along its banks. Something unnatural festers in our community. According to reports, Reverend Lawson's conduct changed when Dr. Whitfield passed away. He rarely left the chapel grounds now, while before he had kept up a public image of respectability in spite of his increasingly bizarre doctrines. His small circle of about 15 awakened disciples was the only group allowed to attend services. At night, strange noises were heard coming from the chapel, which had dark cloth covering its windows. These sounds were characterized as mechanical humming, rhythmic chanting, and a noise like distant singing heard underwater. Finally responding to the community petition, regional Baptist leaders sent Reverend Caleb Morrison to look into the matter in late August. His formal report, which was submitted on September 10, 1872, is noticeably short. Having visited Arkansas Hills and spoken with Reverend Lawson, I find the concerns expressed by certain community members to be based in misunderstanding and rumor. The chapel operates within acceptable doctrinal boundaries, though with some liturgical innovations reflecting the frontier context. Missing persons have been accounted for through correspondence. The matter requires no further denominational attention. If not for a confidential letter that Morrison wrote to his boss, Bishop Edwin Hargrove, witch doctor, Holloway found in the bishop's personal files, this dismissal might have put a stop to official investigation. The confidential, for your eyes only letter offers a radically different interpretation. I write separately from my official report, as what I witnessed at Lawson Chapel extends beyond what I can commit to our official record without risking both credibility and unnecessary alarm. The situation there is far from the benign misunderstanding I publicly reported. Upon arrival, I found the chapel altered beyond recognition as a Baptist house of worship. Lawson himself appears physically changed from when I knew him in Tennessee, gaunt, with peculiar movements and speech patterns that suggest either illness or habitual use of certain substances. His theological positions, shared privately, represent severe heresy, bordering on pagan water worship, mixed with pseudoscientific theories about human anatomy serving as resonant vessels for ancient harmonies. Most concerning was the cellar. I was not permitted full access, but observed enough from the stairs to report that Lawson has constructed what can only be described as a ritual chamber centered around the natural spring. The water itself appears unnaturally still and dark. When disturbed by Lawson's hand, it produced sounds that affected me physically, a vibration felt not in the ears but within the skull itself. Of the missing persons, I saw no direct evidence, though several times I perceived sounds from behind a sealed door that suggested human presence. When questioned directly, Lawson spoke of transformation rather than absence, claiming that those I inquired about had joined with the waters and would emerge perfected when the resonance reaches completion. I believe something terrible occurs in that place, yet find myself unable to articulate specific charges that would warrant official intervention. More troubling still, I experienced disturbing dreams the 2 nights I spent in the settlement, and now find myself plagued by a persistent ringing in my ears that medical consultation has failed to diagnose. I recommend no further official contact with Lawson or his congregation. Instead, I suggest quiet consultation with territorial authorities regarding possible legal violations beyond our ecclesiastical concern. Whatever transpires at Lawson Chapel, I fear it extends beyond heresy into darker territory. For now, my official report will indicate no cause for concern, as I believe drawing further attention may precipitate either flight or more dangerous behavior from Lawson and his followers. Morrison's health deteriorated, as evidenced by a later letter he wrote to Hargrove on the 30th of September 1872. The auditory disturbances I mentioned previously have intensified. I now hear what seems to be distant singing at all hours, particularly when near running water. My physician can find no physical cause and suggests nervous exhaustion. More disturbing are the dreams, vivid visions of submerged chambers where human forms undergo impossible transformations. In these dreams, Lawson appears as a guide, explaining that what I witness is the future evolution of the species and that all waters eventually flow to the same ocean. I fear my brief exposure to whatever occurs at Lawson Chapel has affected me in ways I cannot fully comprehend. I have requested reassignment to a congregation in the Western Territories, as far from Arkansas as possible. Distance may be my only remedy. Morrison suggested that police enforcement become involved, but nothing was done about it. Records indicate that in order to prevent a possible scandal, Bishop Hargrove decided to handle the situation internally. The choice would have far-reaching effects. Northwestern Arkansas was hit by a powerful storm on the evening of the 17th of October, 1872. The White River and its tributaries saw flash flooding as a result of more than 7 inches of rain falling in less than 6 hours, according to weather records. Timber Creek, which ran right beneath Lawson Chapel, was one of these. Pieced together from incomplete testimonies gathered years later, the events of that stormy night are still mainly unconfirmed. Samuel Greer, who lived about a mile downstream from the chapel, provides the most cogent account. Greer reported seeing a strange event at the storm's peak in a statement he gave to a local newspaper in 1875 and later kept in Dr. Holloway's study papers. I was securing my livestock when I noticed the creek water had turned peculiar, darker than mere storm turbidity would explain, with an oily sheen that caught what little light remained. More unsettling was the sound, Above the storm, I could hear what seemed like voices carried in the water itself, not shouting as drowning might cause, but singing in a manner I've never heard before or since. The flow carried unusual debris, not just the expected branches and vegetation, but what appeared to be pieces of furniture, cloth hangings, and objects I couldn't identify in the darkness. Most disturbing was what I glimpsed briefly as lightning illuminated the creek bed. What seemed to be human forms moving within the water itself, not floating atop it as drowned bodies might, but somehow propelling themselves against the current. Their movements were wrong, too fluid, with limbs bending in impossible ways. I glimpsed perhaps 5 or 6 such forms before losing my nerve and retreating indoors, where I remained until daybreak. Observations from the next morning are added to Greer's story. At first light, I followed the creek upstream toward the chapel, concerned about potential casualties from the flood. The waterway was littered with debris, splintered wood, torn fabric, waterlogged books with strange symbols. I recovered one object that particularly disturbed me. What appeared to be a glass container similar to a specimen jar, labeled with the name Thomas Mercer. The jar contained what I initially took to be preserved tissue, but upon closer inspection seemed to be a partially formed ear with unusual structural modifications. As I approached the chapel site, I encountered Joseph Hardin and several other men from the settlement. They prevented my further advance, stating only that the flood had revealed unnatural things and that they were handling the matter privately. Hardin took the specimen jar from me and made me swear not to speak of what I had found. I kept that promise until now, 3 years later. But the dreams of those fluid forms moving against the current have never ceased. I believe the community deserves to know what occurred at Lawson Chapel, even if the full truth proves too terrible for complete disclosure. Lawson Chapel was found to be mostly destroyed the morning after the storm. The subterranean spring had flooded, causing the building to partially collapse into what looked like a sinkhole. Although no survivors were formally reported found, community records show that a small group of men, led by Joseph Hardin, visited the scene to look for survivors. On the other hand, Hardin's private journal presents another account. What we discovered can never be spoken of openly. The chapel floor had given way entirely, exposing the cellar and the chambers beyond that none of us had known existed. The spring had become a surging pool that filled most of the space. Along the walls were alcoves containing what I can only describe as cocoons, fashioned from a substance resembling hardened wax mixed with human hair. Several had ruptured from within. Of Lawson himself, we found no trace, though his private quarters contained journals documenting what he termed the transformation process, detailed records of how long each vessel required to achieve resonance and join with the surd waters. The names corresponded to those reported missing over recent months. The technical language and anatomical drawings suggest a disturbing blend of religious fervor and methodical experimentation. We made the only decision conscience would allow. We gathered all materials, sealed the remaining intact cocoons in the cellar, collapsed what remained of the structure upon it, and burnt everything that would burn. Afterward, we agreed never to speak of what we had seen. Some horrors are best buried and forgotten. According to a later note in Hardin's diary dated the 25th of October 1872, the men's efforts might not have been enough. The creek runs clear again, but none will drink from it or use it for crops. Thomas Walsh's hunting dog refuses to cross the water, growling at nothing visible. Most disturbing was the discovery this morning. Footprints leading from the creek to William Reed's barn and back again. The prints showed no ordinary human foot, but something elongated with what appeared to be webbing between the toes. Reed claims to have heard singing in his well before dawn. We have agreed to post watches at night until the first hard freeze, hoping winter will end whatever escaped our efforts at the chapel site. The chapel was abandoned after being destroyed by storm damage, according to the official record. The hamlet of Arkansas Hills itself started to deteriorate soon after, with several families moving over the next few months. But no deaths were noted because the majority of those who had stayed with Lawson until the very end had already been reported as having departed on mission work. The region was mostly deserted by 1874 and was later incorporated into growing county territories. If Dr. Holloway hadn't found those initial allusions to the Lawson Chapel tragedy in 1962, the narrative would have stayed hidden. In addition to the occurrences mentioned above, her further research turned up unsettling epilogues that implied the incident's consequences persisted long after that stormy night. Unusual reports surfaced from settlements downstream of the former chapel site throughout the White River watershed between 1873 and 1875. There are several reports of encounters with odd people discovered close to the river, especially during periods of intense precipitation. According to reports, these people moved with an unnerving fluidity and spoke in voices that sounded as though they were resonating through water. They denied any knowledge of the village or chapel, but when asked, they frequently provided names that matched individuals who had vanished from Arkansas Hills. In December 1873, a Fayetteville doctor wrote a report detailing how he treated a woman who was discovered unconscious by the river and had physical abnormalities that were out of line with normal human physiology. The patient reportedly regained consciousness during examination, showed unusual strength and agility, and fled the facility, according to the report, which also mentions translucent membranous structures between fingers and unusual elasticity of joint connections, as well as auditory structures modified in a manner suggesting intentional surgical alteration. According to the doctor, she moved toward the river, and witnesses claim she entered the water and did not resurface. Dr. Holloway found the doctor's private notes among medical school records, which provide more information not included in the official report. The subject's body temperature registered nearly 10 degrees below normal, yet she showed no signs of hypothermia. Respiratory rate was approximately 1 breath per minute, suggesting profound adaptation to low oxygen conditions. Most remarkable were the structures observed within the auditory canal, modifications that appeared to be neither injury nor congenital defect, but rather a functional redesign of the human ear. The additional membranes and resonating chambers would theoretically allow perception of sound frequencies well beyond normal human hearing range, particularly sounds conducted through water. Before her escape, the subject spoke briefly, though the words were difficult to comprehend. Something about "we're joining the congregation" and the calling of deeper waters. She also mentioned a name, Thomas Lawson, whom she referred to as the vessel that brought the song. I cannot reconcile these observations with known medical science and find myself questioning the reliability of my own examination. The subject's escape, witnessed by 3 staff members, involved movements described as more serpentine than human and the apparent ability to dislocate joints to pass through confined spaces. An abandoned camp near the White River, about 30 miles downstream from the old Arkansas Hills town, was discovered in April 1874, according to another occurrence recorded in territorial law enforcement documents. Unusual artifacts were found at the site, including notebooks written in a cipher that investigators were unable to decipher, modified musical instruments, and glass containers that resembled those mentioned in Dr. Whitfield's notes. A thorough diagram of the river system with markers at precise locations, including a number of populated regions, was the most unsettling. According to the findings, unusually shaped footprints were discovered both to and from the water, indicating that the camp's inhabitants mostly used the river for transportation rather than land routes. The story of Thomas Reed, a fisherman who said he saw Reverend Lawson himself in the spring of 1874 on the White River, was possibly the most unsettling. Reed's story, which was recorded by a local newspaper editor but never published, continues with details that the editor apparently thought were too fantastic for print. I knew him by the description, though changed. He spoke of gathering his congregation and how the waters would carry their song beyond the territory. When I asked his name, he smiled in a way that showed teeth that seemed too numerous and said, "I am the vessel that brings the water's resonance. I left immediately and did not fish that spot again." He wasn't alone on the riverbank. His skin had a waxy pallor and his movements were wrong, too smooth, as if his bones had been removed. There were others, partially submerged in the shallows. I counted at least 7 figures. Their forms were difficult to discern clearly, as they seemed to blend with the water itself. They were singing, though I hesitate to call it music as humans make it. The sound bypassed my ears somehow, vibrating directly in my skull. I felt a powerful urge to enter the water and approach them, an urge I resisted only by recalling my wife and children waiting at home. As I departed, Lawson called after me, saying, "The waters connect all things. You've heard our song now. Eventually, you'll follow it to its source." For weeks afterward, I heard that same singing whenever near running water, though it has mercifully faded with time. Over the ensuing years, similar tales surfaced occasionally, but less frequently, throughout the region. In 1875, Territorial Governor Elisha Baxter wrote to federal authorities about unusual transients in the White River watershed and asked for expert help in examining anatomical anomalies presented by remains discovered near Beaver Creek. There is no record of any response that was sent. According to Dr. Holloway's 1,963 study notes, she became increasingly convinced that the Lawson Chapel episode was more than a case of isolated insanity or religious extremism. The pattern of subsequent water-related encounters suggests the possibility that whatever occurred in that chapel cellar achieved some form of continuation beyond the structural destruction of the site. She wrote in her final entry dated June 4, 1963, "The consistent descriptions of auditory phenomena in both contemporary accounts and later encounters suggest that sound, or some form of vibration, played a central role in whatever process Lawson developed." One of her final notes includes a sketch of what she called theoretical modifications to human auditory structures based on contemporary descriptions. The unsettling illustration showing altered inner ear components and additional resonating chambers extending into the sinus cavities and throat. This drawing is accompanied by a note. If sound serves as the primary vector of transformation, the implications extend far beyond conventional modes of influence. A specific frequency or harmonic pattern, properly amplified and directed through water as a conducting medium, might theoretically induce physiological changes in susceptible individuals. Lawson appears to have discovered or developed such a method, though whether through genuine innovation or by drawing on sources unknown to conventional science remains unclear. The scheduled site inspection by Dr. Holloway was never carried out. According to university records, she had a medical emergency on the evening of June 4th and spent several weeks in the hospital. She then resigned and apparently moved to Arizona. There are no more studies or publications listed under her name. The reasons behind her decision to stop the research are still unknown. In 1968, Dr. Holloway's niece provided access to her hospital records, which describe acute auditory hallucinations and paranoid ideation involving water sources. According to the attending physician, the patient repeatedly expresses concern about singing coming from the bathroom pipes and refuses to bathe or consume water without extensive testing. When she was released, she reportedly informed colleagues that she could no longer pursue her research because the waters remember and they've noticed my attention. Despite being stored in a climate-controlled environment, the audio recordings of Holloway's interviews with Sarah Millbrook and other indirect witnesses had been damaged by what appeared to be water exposure. According to the university archivist who finally cataloged her materials in 1968, during the cataloging process, several staff members reported experiencing recurring dreams involving submersion in dark water and hearing voices calling their names. 2 staff members requested reassignment after developing persistent auditory phenomena described as singing heard through walls and voices emanating from plumbing fixtures. The few salvageable portions reportedly contained unusual background noise, described as similar to distant choral singing, but at frequencies that caused physical discomfort when amplified. The archivist's report includes an odd addendum. While I hesitate to suggest a causal relationship with the Holloway materials, the correlation merits documentation, if only to alert future researchers to potential psychological effects associated with prolonged exposure to this subject matter. Present-day maps do not show the location of Lawson Chapel. In 1967, Park Ranger James Collins, in an unofficial interview with a university student, related an experience he refused to include in official reports. In the area, Electronic depth finders malfunction there, producing what one guide described as sounds like voices trying to sing through the speaker. Local fishing guides sometimes mention that the location is poor for fishing. During inspection rounds in '65, shortly after the lake filled, I took a boat over what my map indicated was the old Arkansas Hill settlement. The area was partially flooded with the construction of Beaver Lake in the 1960 seconds, placing the former location under approximately 20 feet of water. The depth finder began emitting unusual sounds, not the standard pings, but something that resembled choral music. At the same time, the water around the boat became noticeably darker, though the day was clear. I felt vibrations through the hull that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity rather than through normal hearing. Most disturbing was the distinct impression that something was rising from the depths beneath the boat, not a fish or debris, but forms that appeared almost human in outline, though distorted in proportion. I started the motor and left immediately. Later that week, 2 teenagers swimming in that general area disappeared. Their bodies were never recovered, despite extensive searching. According to reports, a graduate student called Michael Collins copied a number of important documents in 1969 as part of a planned thesis on frontier religious movements, just before Dr. Holloway's original research materials were purportedly destroyed during campus renovations. His roommate later reported that Collins had developed an obsession with sound frequencies that could change biological structures and had built makeshift audio equipment that he would put in his bathtub during late night experiments. Collins never finished this thesis, and university records show he left the program in October 1969 for personal reasons. When university housing staff finally cleared out Collins's abandoned apartment, the walls were covered with transcriptions from Lawson's recovered journals, anatomical drawings of modified human auditory structures, and musical notations labeled approximated resonance patterns. On October 12, 1969, Collins wrote in his journal, "I've managed to reconstruct what I believe to be the fundamental frequency Lawson utilized in his transformative process. The mathematical relationships he described correspond to acoustic properties that would indeed create standing wave patterns in enclosed bodies of water, patterns that might theoretically affect biological tissue through prolonged exposure. Tomorrow, I will test the complete harmonic sequence. If successful, I should be able to observe immediate effects on the cellular samples." The final entry dated October 15th simply states, "The water answered. They've been waiting. I understand now what Lawson meant about vessels and resonance. The human form is merely a transitional stage. The waters have always been our true home, and they're calling us to return. I hear them clearly now, not just in my experiments, but in every drop of water, from the shower, from the drinking fountain, from the condensation on my window. Tonight, I go to the lake. I've left copies of my key findings with Professor Marston, though I doubt he'll understand their significance until it's too late. The waters are rising, not just physically, but in influence. Each person who hears the resonance becomes a new vessel to carry it further. Lawson was merely the first to understand, but he won't be the last." Collins vanished from view. Despite filing a missing persons report, the investigation was unsuccessful. His purportedly lost study materials with Professor Marston were never found. The following semester, Marston himself retired early and moved to Colorado, where he allegedly forbade former co-workers from talking about Collins or his work. Bishop Harold Matthews's 1969 private letter to the Regional Baptist Historical Society in response to a question on Dr. Holloway's research contains the final known mention of the Lawson Chapel incident. I would strongly advise against further investigation into this matter. Some episodes in our denominational history serve no constructive purpose in remembering. The decision to expunge certain records was made by our predecessors, with what I believe to be sound judgment and genuine concern for the spiritual welfare of the broader community. There are ripples that continue long after the initial stone has sunk beneath the surface. Matthews's letter continues with a deeper reflection. I must confess that my own brief review of the partial documentation assembled by Dr. Holloway left me profoundly disturbed, not merely by the content itself, but by its persistent effects on my psychological well-being. For several weeks afterward, I experienced auditory phenomena that defied rational explanation, most notably the distinct impression of choral singing emanating from plumbing fixtures in my home. More disturbing was the recurring dream of standing before a congregation composed not of ordinary parishioners, but of figures that seemed only partially human, their forms fluid, and their voices resonating in harmonies beyond normal human capacity. In this dream, I find myself not repulsed but drawn toward them, as if some part of me recognizes their state as evolution rather than aberration. I share this deeply personal experience only to emphasize the seriousness of my recommendation. This matter should remain buried, not from fear of institutional embarrassment, but from concern for the well-being of those who might be susceptible to whatever influence continues to radiate from this historical episode. The records remain officially expunged. The microfilm copies of Dr. Holloway's research collection are listed as damaged beyond recovery in university catalog records. What transpired at Lawson Chapel in 1872 is now mostly a collection of disjointed pieces and abandoned investigations, a story purposefully deconstructed by those who experienced it firsthand. The fact that this historical erasure may not have been totally successful, however, is probably its most disturbing feature. Water never stops flowing, transporting its contents to new places. The foundations of Lawson Chapel, as well as anything that could not be destroyed by fire or collapsed timber, are likely still visible beneath Beaver Lake's surface. Although the spring's waters now mix with those of a much bigger reservoir, it still contributes to the watershed in northwest Arkansas. Abnormal readings from the region that corresponded to the historic Arkansas Hills community were included in a geological survey of Beaver Lake conducted in 1973. The report notes, sonar mapping revealed an unusual formation at coordinates matching the historical location of Timber Creek. Rather than the expected collapsed structures typical of flooded settlements, imaging showed what appears to be a chamber extending approximately 30 feet below the lakebed, far deeper than any building foundation from the 1,870 seconds would reasonably reach. More puzzling was the temperature differential recorded in the water column above this formation, nearly 8 degrees warmer than surrounding waters. Despite the depth, scheduled investigation by a dive team was canceled following equipment malfunctions and unexplained audio interference with communication systems. An internal memo attached to this report, marked "Not for public distribution," adds, 2 members of the preliminary assessment team have requested transfer following the initial survey of Area 17, the designation given to the Arkansas Hills location. Engineer Reynolds specifically mentioned voices emerging from shower drain and dreams of underwater singing. Recommend indefinite postponement of further investigation of Area 17 anomalies, with appropriate notation in restricted access files to prevent inadvertent future authorization of research at this location. Additionally, both people reported persistent auditory phenomena and sleep disturbances after working in this sector. On still nights, locals still occasionally report strange sounds moving across the water, which they describe as human voices singing without breathing, audible only when one's ears are partially submerged. In spite of favorable conditions, wildlife officials observe that some parts of the lake have an inexplicably low number of fish, and swimmers occasionally report experiencing gentle tugging sensations, as if fingers were testing their skin from below. In the summer of 1968, 3 teenagers swimming near the restricted area vanished under the surface, as friends saw them suddenly pulling downward, as if grabbed from below. 3 days later, their bodies were recovered, and county officials sealed the autopsy results. A local reporter was later informed by a nurse who was present during the examination that the remains exhibited unusual modifications to the throat and ear structures and partial webbing between fingers and toes that could not be explained as normal decomposition effects. In 1969, a family boating on the lake reported that their radio abruptly changed from music to what they called underwater singing, human voices but all wrong. Their 8-year-old daughter, who had previously been described as being afraid of water, reportedly became enthralled with the sound and tried to jump overboard before her parents restrained her. This was the most recent incident that has been documented. In the weeks that followed, The youngster allegedly talked about people calling from under the lake and sketched images of people with elongated limbs and features her teacher described as more fish than human. That stormy night in 1872 might not have concluded with the resonance Reverend Lawson aimed to create between flesh and water, between the human vessel and what he thought resided in the spring beneath his chapel. Maybe it just changed shape, becoming less distinct but still present, a ripple that continued to spread beyond the limits of the former Arkansas hills, carried by rivers that never stopped flowing. In Dr. Holloway's final recovered note, written from her hospital bed before her retreat to Arizona, she reflected, "Sound travels differently, through water than air, more efficiently, with less distortion over distance. The human body is approximately 60% water." Perhaps Lawson understood something fundamental about our nature that science has yet to fully comprehend. We are not merely terrestrial beings who occasionally interact with water. We are primarily aquatic in our internal composition. The boundary between our watery interior and the waters that surround us is perhaps more permeable than we care to acknowledge. What if that boundary can be dissolved through the right resonance? What if the waters within us can be made to recognize and respond to the waters without? And most disturbing of all, what if something dwells within those external waters that seeks communion with the waters we contain within ourselves? I hear it now, not with my ears, but with something deeper, a singing that calls to the very fluids that comprise my physical form. They say water has no memory, but I have come to believe otherwise. Water remembers, water connects, and water waits, patient beyond human reckoning. The withdrawal of Dr. Holloway marked the official end of the probe. No university has approved additional investigation into the Lawson Chapel incident or its seeming aftermath. Thomas Lawson and his chapel are not listed in the official archives of the Baptist Historical Society. For this reason, Beaver Lake's waters continue to flow over the remains of Lawson Chapel, carrying their secrets downstream to the White River, then to the Mississippi, and finally to the ocean, where all waters eventually converge. The site's coordinates are still unmarked on public maps of Beaver Lake, though some government surveys include a notation that simply reads Area 17. No diving authorized. We don't know what harmonies might be heard there, in the darkest recesses where light never penetrates. However, pay close attention when it rains on calm water at night. From beneath the surface, you may hear a sound that sounds like distant singing. Not quite human, not quite foreign. And before you let your ears rest on that resonant harmony for too long, keep in mind the tale of Reverend Thomas Lawson and his church. The line between the listener and the thing being listened for may be more porous than you ever thought, since some tunes, once heard, continue to reverberate inside your own waters long after the outside sound has stopped.